In the spring of 1942, Edwin Layton drew a map that should have been impossible. He marked where the Japanese carrier force would appear. He marked the direction, the distance, the hour. Then he handed that forecast to Admiral Chester Nimitz and waited. When an American patrol plane finally found the enemy on June 4, Layton's estimate was wrong by only 5 degrees, 5 miles, and 5 minutes. That would be remarkable for any intelligence officer. For Layton, it was almost unbearable. Because 6 months earlier, the same man had stood over another map of the Pacific and admitted that he could not find Japan's 6 largest aircraft carriers. He did not know where they were until their aircraft were already over Pearl Harbor. 2 maps, the same ocean, the same officer. One was nearly perfect. The other was catastrophically blank. The easy explanation is redemption. A disgraced analyst learns from failure, sharpens his instincts, and saves the fleet at Midway. It is also the wrong explanation. Layton did not become a different man in 6 months. The system around him did. And the difference between Pearl Harbor and Midway was not simply that America broke a better code. It was that, after December 7, information that had been sealed inside separate rooms was finally allowed to reach the people who could act on it. That is the real story of Midway. Not a miracle of prediction. A revolution in who was permitted to know what. In late 1941, American leaders had good reason to feel confident about their codebreakers. A secret program known as Magic had penetrated Japan's highest-level diplomatic cipher, a machine the Americans called Purple. The achievement was extraordinary. Japanese diplomats sent encrypted messages between Tokyo and their embassies. American cryptanalysts could often recover the meaning, translate it, and place it before senior officials with astonishing speed. To men in Washington, this felt like access to Japan's inner mind. But Magic illuminated only one room, and the war was being planned in another. Purple carried diplomacy, negotiations, ultimatums, political instructions, embassy reports. It did not normally carry the sailing orders of a carrier division. It did not reveal the route of a strike force. It did not say which aircraft would be armed, which tankers would refuel them, or which morning the first wave would launch. For that, American naval intelligence needed to penetrate Japan's operational naval system, JN-25. JN-25 was not a simple substitution cipher. It combined a massive code book with additional numbers that concealed the original groups again. Even when an American station captured a transmission perfectly, the page could remain unreadable. The radio signal was real. The meaning was buried. So officers in Hawaii relied heavily on traffic analysis. Traffic analysis is intelligence built from the outside of a message. Who transmitted, from where, to whom, how often, which call sign appeared beside which other call sign. It is the military equivalent of watching lights switch on and off in distant buildings, then trying to infer what is happening inside. When a known carrier call sign appeared repeatedly near the inland sea, analysts could place that carrier near Japan. When the pattern shifted south, they could suspect a movement toward the Philippines or Malaya. The method could be powerful, but it had one fatal dependency. The enemy had to transmit. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood that. In November 1941, the strike force that would attack Pearl Harbor sailed into the North Pacific under severe radio silence. The carriers stopped producing the electronic pattern American listeners expected to follow. Whether every deceptive signal from Japan was centrally orchestrated or not, the effect was the same. Routine radio activity in home waters reinforced the belief that the carriers remained near Japan while the real force moved through cold, empty ocean. To traffic analysts, the fleet did not look like an approaching weapon. It looked like an absence, and inside the American command that absence was made worse by another kind of silence. The Army and Navy both guarded access to Magic. Distribution lists were narrow. Raw decrypts were treated like radioactive material. Officials feared, with reason, that careless circulation might reveal that Purple had been broken. But secrecy produced a dangerous inversion. Protecting the source became more important than equipping the commander. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, did receive warnings that war was approaching. What he did not receive was the full diplomatic picture in the same form and tempo available to senior officials in Washington. His intelligence officer, Edwin Layton, was expected to plot the Japanese Navy across a wall map at Pearl Harbor, while much of the diplomatic crisis remained outside his room. This was not total ignorance. There were warnings, intercepted patterns, submarine movements, and signs of Japanese expansion. But the evidence was fragmented across organizations with different missions, different authorities, and different fears. No single officer at Pearl Harbor could place all the pieces on one table. That distinction matters. Pearl Harbor was not caused by one missing message. It was the product of many failures converging. Strategic assumptions, poor readiness, incomplete sharing, operational deception, and an enemy plan designed to exploit American expectations. But Layton's daily problem was brutally simple. He could not locate the carriers. On December 2, Kimmel asked him where Japan's first air fleet was. Layton had to say that he did not know. Kimmel pressed the point with dark humor. Could those carriers be rounding Diamond Head without anyone realizing it? Layton answered that he hoped they would be sighted before they reached that point. 5 days later, aircraft from those carriers came over Oahu. The map had not failed because Layton lacked intelligence. It failed because American intelligence was not yet functioning as one organism. Washington held diplomatic evidence. Different naval stations held fragments of radio traffic. Commanders held operational responsibility. But the doors between those rooms were narrow, guarded, and slow. The Japanese did not have to make America blind. America had already divided its own field of vision. Then came December 7. The attack destroyed battleships, aircraft, and lives. It also destroyed the credibility of the peacetime intelligence structure. After Pearl Harbor, there was no longer patience for elegant chains of review. No time for polished summaries traveling across an ocean. No tolerance for an analyst in Hawaii learning too late what another office had known days earlier. Admiral Chester Nimitz arrived to take command of the Pacific Fleet with almost no margin for another surprise. Japan was advancing across Asia and the Pacific. Wake Island had fallen. The Philippines were collapsing. Japanese forces were moving through the Dutch East Indies. The American fleet could not match Japan ship for ship. It had to know where the next blow would land before the blow was launched. That pressure changed the relationship between Layton and Station HYPO. HYPO was the Navy's code-breaking center in Hawaii, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort. It operated in cramped windowless rooms at Pearl Harbor, filled with punched cards, message logs, maps, and men living on exhaustion. Rochefort was unconventional, abrasive, and deeply skilled. His team was not reading every Japanese message, far from it. But by early 1942, they could recover enough code groups, enough fragments, and enough traffic patterns to begin constructing intent. The critical change was not just technical, it was organizational. Rochefort's team could pass raw findings quickly to Layton. Layton could combine them with operations, geography, Japanese doctrine, and what he knew of enemy commanders. Then he could carry that assessment directly to Nimitz. The chain was short, the feedback was immediate. A fragment that looked meaningless to a cryptanalyst could become significant when Layton placed it beside fleet movements. A commander's question could be sent back downstairs, where HYPO could search for exactly the pattern needed to answer it. For the first time, the people decoding the signals, interpreting the enemy, and moving the ships were working inside the same decision loop. The walls had not vanished, but doors had been cut through them. HYPO also changed what counted as valuable traffic. A carrier commander could maintain radio silence. A fleet's logistics could not. Warships consumed fuel, bombs, torpedoes, replacement aircraft, food, water, charts, medical supplies, spare parts. An operation involving dozens of ships and thousands of men produced an administrative wake. So the analysts listened for that wake. They tracked unusual requisitions. They compared call signs. They watched traffic rise between bases. They noted references to weather, fuel, air groups, landing forces, and transport schedules. One message might reveal almost nothing. Hundreds of fragments placed beside one another could expose the outline of an operation. By the spring of 1942, that outline was enormous. Japan was preparing another major offensive. The question was where. A location designator kept appearing in the traffic. 2 letters. HYPO believed AF meant Midway. The logic was strong. Midway sat northwest of Hawaii, a small atoll with an airfield and an outsized strategic position. Capture it, and Japan would push its reconnaissance perimeter closer to Pearl Harbor. Attack it, and Yamamoto could force the remaining American carriers into battle. That last point was crucial. Yamamoto did not merely want the island. He wanted the American carriers. Pearl Harbor had crippled the battleship force, but the carriers had been absent that morning. As long as they survived, the United States retained a mobile weapon capable of striking back. The Doolittle raid in April 1942 had made that danger impossible for Japan to ignore. American bombers had reached the Japanese home islands. The material damage was limited. The psychological damage was immense. Yamamoto wanted a battle that would remove the carrier threat permanently. Operation MI was designed to create that battle. Japanese carrier aircraft would strike Midway. An invasion force would seize the atoll. A separate operation in the Aleutian Islands would widen American confusion. Submarines would form a screen east of Midway. The American fleet, supposedly unaware of the plan, would rush out from Pearl Harbor after the attack began. Then Yamamoto's dispersed forces would close the trap. On paper, the operation was immense. It was also built on a single assumption: the Americans would react late. Japan's plan required surprise not only at Midway but inside the American decision cycle. If Nimitz moved before the Japanese expected him to move, the geometry changed. The hunter could enter the trap first. But Washington was not convinced that AF was Midway. Naval intelligence officers on the East Coast considered other possibilities, including targets in the North Pacific. The disagreement was not trivial. The Japanese really were planning an Aleutian operation. That meant both sides of the argument could point to real evidence. For Nimitz, the consequence was brutal. He had only a few carriers. Enterprise and Hornet were available. Yorktown had been damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea and was limping back to Pearl Harbor. If Nimitz sent his strength north and Midway was the main target, he could lose the Central Pacific. If he concentrated near Midway and Washington was right about a northern main effort, he would have exposed Alaska and perhaps the West Coast. He did not need another opinion. He needed proof. That proof came from an idea as simple as it was audacious. If AF was Midway, then a problem reported from Midway should reappear in Japanese traffic attached to AF. Using a secure undersea cable, Hawaii instructed the Midway garrison to broadcast a false report in plain language. The island's water system was failing. Fresh water was running short. The message was intentionally vulnerable to interception. Then HYPO waited. The value of the deception was not that it fooled Japan into changing the operation. It forced Japan to label the target in its own internal communications. Soon an intercepted Japanese message reported that AF had a water shortage. The ambiguity collapsed. AF was Midway. The codebreakers had not solved every layer of JN-25. They had done something more operationally useful. They had asked the enemy a question and designed the environment so the enemy would answer. That was the decisive leap from passive listening to active intelligence. Rochefort's team had found the label. Layton could now build the picture. Japanese traffic and partial decrypts suggested the timing, the approach, and the scale of the attack. Layton assessed that the carrier striking force would approach from the northwest and reach a point roughly 175 miles from Midway around 6 in the morning on June 4. Nimitz accepted the estimate. Then he made the decision that transformed intelligence into strategy. He ordered Enterprise and Hornet toward a position northeast of Midway. Yorktown entered Pearl Harbor badly damaged and was given emergency repairs at extraordinary speed. Shipyard crews worked around the clock. A repair job expected to take months was reduced to days because the fleet did not need Yorktown restored to perfection. It needed Yorktown able to fight. By the end of May, 3 American carriers were moving toward an empty patch of ocean later remembered as Point Luck. They were outnumbered. Their aircraft groups were uneven. Their torpedo planes were obsolete. Their crews had never fought a carrier battle on this scale, but they had one advantage Japan did not know existed. They were already waiting. This is where the legend of intelligence can become misleading. Knowing the enemy's plan did not make the battle safe. It did not tell every pilot where to fly. It did not prevent communication failures. It did not turn outdated aircraft into modern ones. Intelligence gave Nimitz a chance to arrange the first move. Combat would decide whether that chance survived contact with reality. Before dawn on June 4, Japanese aircraft launched against Midway. The island's radar detected them. Midway's fighters rose to meet the raid and suffered heavily. Bombs struck the atoll, but the airfield remained usable. The Japanese strike leader reported that a second attack would be necessary. At almost the same time, American patrol aircraft were searching the ocean. At 5:34 in the morning, a PBY Catalina sent the contact that every room at Pearl Harbor had been waiting to hear. Enemy carriers. When the reported position was placed on the map, Layton's forecast was almost on top of it. 5 degrees. 5 miles. 5 minutes. The officer who had been unable to place 6 carriers in December had placed 4 carriers in June with almost mathematical precision. Not because he had suddenly learned how to see through fog. Because this time the fragments had reached him. This time, cryptanalysts could challenge assumptions. This time the commander trusted the local intelligence team enough to move before certainty was complete. And this time the enemy's silence was no longer treated as absence. It was treated as one clue among many. The American carriers began launching. Almost immediately, the battle dissolved into confusion. Different squadrons took different courses. Some could not find the Japanese fleet. Fuel gauges dropped. Radio coordination failed. The first attacks from Midway's land-based aircraft caused little damage. Then came the carrier torpedo squadrons. They approached low and slow. Japanese Zero fighters tore into them. Anti-aircraft fire filled the air. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet was effectively destroyed. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise suffered catastrophic losses. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown was mauled. Their torpedoes scored no decisive hits. From the cockpit level, the ambush looked like a massacre. The intelligence victory seemed to be vanishing beneath burning aircraft. But the attacks were changing the battle in ways no single pilot could see. Japanese fighters had been pulled down to low altitude. Combat air patrols were scattered. The carriers were maneuvering. And aboard the Japanese flagships, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo faced a rapidly changing problem. He had launched his first strike against Midway while keeping reserve aircraft available in case American ships appeared. When Midway seemed to require another attack, preparations shifted toward land targets. Then reports arrived that American naval forces had been sighted. Orders changed again. Aircraft returning from Midway needed to land. Fighters needed fuel and ammunition. Strike planes needed the correct weapons. The famous image of Japanese decks covered end-to-end with loose bombs and torpedoes is too simple. Much of the rearming occurred in the hangars, and the exact sequence has been debated, but the operational truth is clear. Nagumo's carriers were caught in a compressed cycle of recovery, rearming, refueling, and decision-making. The American presence had arrived earlier than Japanese planning allowed. That timing was the real weapon Nimitz had purchased. At 10:22 in the morning, American dive bombers appeared above the Japanese carriers. Enterprise SPD Dauntless aircraft descended on Kaga and Akagi. Yorktown's group struck Soryu. Within minutes, 3 carriers were burning. Fuel, armed aircraft, and ordnance turned damage into catastrophe. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, struck back and helped cripple Yorktown. But American dive bombers found Hiryu later that afternoon. By the end of the battle, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers that had attacked Midway were lost. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The core of the striking force that had attacked Pearl Harbor was broken. Japan still possessed a powerful navy. The war would continue for 3 brutal years. But the strategic initiative in the Pacific had shifted. And it had shifted because an intelligence system had learned to move faster than the plan it was reading. That is why the comparison between Layton's 2 maps matters. It is tempting to treat the blank map of December as proof of incompetence and the precise map of June as proof of genius. Both judgments miss the mechanism. An analyst is never just a mind standing over a chart. He is the final point in a chain. Sensors collect. Operators intercept. Cryptanalysts recover fragments. Administrators decide who may see them. Commanders decide what risk they will accept. Break any link, and a brilliant analyst can become blind. Connect the links, and the same analyst can appear prophetic. Pearl Harbor and Midway were not opposites because one man changed. They were opposites because the flow of information changed. Before Pearl Harbor, intelligence was treated as property. Washington offices protected access. Departments defended jurisdiction. Warnings were filtered upward and sanitized downward. The people closest to the operational problem often received the smallest portion of the picture. After Pearl Harbor, at least within Nimitz's Pacific Command, intelligence became a working conversation. HYPO did not simply send a report and disappear. Rochefort, Layton, and Nimitz argued over living evidence. They tested hypotheses. They exploited contradictions. They used deception to obtain confirmation. And they made decisions while uncertainty still existed. That last point is essential. The Midway estimate was not perfect knowledge. The Americans did not know every Japanese movement. They did not fully read every message. They did not eliminate disagreement. What they built was not omniscience. It was a system capable of turning incomplete evidence into timely action. That is harder and far more valuable. After the war, Layton remained haunted by the contrast. He believed the pre-war system had denied commanders in Hawaii access to critical context and had later allowed institutions to protect themselves with secrecy. He spent years pursuing records and arguing that Pearl Harbor could not be understood by blaming one commander, one analyst, or one missed clue. The historical record is more complicated than any single accusation. No file contains a clean sentence announcing the attack on Pearl Harbor in time to stop it. No intercepted document handed Washington the entire plan. But Layton's central warning survives the debate. Information can exist inside a government without becoming knowledge. Knowledge can exist without reaching command. And command can receive a warning without receiving enough context to act correctly. Those are 3 different failures. Military organizations often focus on collecting more intercepts, more sensors, more analysts, more secrecy. But Midway demonstrated that collection alone is not the decisive advantage. The decisive advantage is connection. The right fragment must reach the right interpreter. The interpreter must be able to challenge the official assumption. The commander must be willing to move before the evidence becomes comfortable. At Pearl Harbor, America possessed pieces of a warning and kept them in separate rooms. At Midway, those rooms were forced open. The Pacific War did not turn when the United States suddenly learned how to read Japan. It turned when the United States finally learned how to let its own people speak to one another.